Hello and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. In this one I've been thinking about how is it that the American population just 90 years after their signing of their constitution and becoming a free country and everything, how they managed to get duped into turning their country into a corporation. Now this ties in very much with the theme of finances, because as you might have remembered, the Americans were left with large debts after their independence, owing to the bankers in Europe, the Rothschilds and such like. And so there was an economic sense to it to turn this into a corporation. And the bankers and everything were controlled by already established corporations. Now the biggest corporation, if you like, in the world is basically only 2.9 square kilometres. That's about, what, less than a couple of miles square, which is the City of London. It's actually, like the Vatican City, is not actually neither a country nor part of England. It is totally independent, and it's very interesting, the history and the way that that actually happened. It's also important to really understand a little bit of how that happened, to understand our financial demise at the moment and our slavery to multinational corporations, and how our countries have all become corporations as well. And the way the American country became a corporation is understandable when you consider the history of the City of London. Now the City of London was a town that was established by the Romans back in 43 AD, that's 43 years after Jesus left the planet, and before their empire fell. And sure enough, by 410 the Roman Empire had crumbled sufficiently that the Romans left England and returned to Rome and Italy and all that, and left London in a state of abandonment. The town itself, being back then, had 50 or 60,000 people, they estimate, maybe, and yet it got smaller and smaller as it got more and more abandoned, and it went into disrepair. And over the years, the Vikings attacked and different groups attacked and tried taking over until about 886. Alfred the Great basically shifted in and decided to rebuild it and turn it into a town because it was strategic. So he started to rebuild it. Now by 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, that's the 10th century, 11th century, is it? Yes. It was William II, I think, who was a Norman, which is basically the Vikings that had settled the north of France and conquered and all that, and so they were sort of like Viking French invaders, but they were very well established, of course. So William II attacked the city, didn't manage to get through the Tower of London, but went round the back, crossed the River Thames and went in the back way and everything, and conquered them, and he basically won the battle there. And so it came under Norman conquest there. By 1075 it got interesting, because interestingly, since he was sort of French Viking type of thing, he actually gave the City of London a charter. Now a charter is not really law. And this is, a charter is basically the set of rules that govern a corporation, that govern a business. And so the City of London, the people in that town, the King, William II, he decided that he was going to give them a certain amount of autonomy and gave them a set of rules, a business handbook, as it were, and he turned them into a corporation. And by and in 1130 they got a sheriff, then a lieutenancy, then by 1215 they were able to elect their own mayor, and by 1630 they were now considered a a corporation, and they even had the gall to say no to the king when the king wanted them to expand their territory and their size. They refused the king, and he submitted to it. Now it was in 1141, by there about 1141, the 12th century, about the beginning of the Renaissance that we know, if you put it into context, the Renaissance with all those Michelangelo type artists and stuff. At that time, the townspeople who had their separate set of rules to run by as sort of a business, banks had shifted in, insurance companies, and it had become prosperous under this king, and he had given them the corporation, and the people within the city were now considered to be a single body of, a single community, a single body of people, and therefore a corporation. And they had their charter, and so they basically could act as a single body. The first corporation in England, I suppose it would be, who then had rule even higher than the king eventually. They had the audacity to say no to the king. Now, because it was very businesslike and had its charter and was independent, there were many other places in England also that were given autonomy or independence to a degree, different degrees, so that they could defend the country better. Different boroughs and counties were given a certain amount of freedom to defend themselves against invading Vikings and stuff, so they were given independence, and they became independent counties independent from the common law or the king's law of the country. London was one of those, since it had its charter and now it was deemed a corporation, and it also had independence from the king. And over the centuries, they have repealed the necessity for self-defense and having that independence basically disappeared because they didn't get attacked in the same manner. And so those were basically dissolved and put back under the rule of the king and the country, except London. London was never brought back under the umbrella of the king and the country. It remained independent, and it remained independent, I suspect, because there were a whole heap of banks setting up there, which was convenient to the kings and queens to have these businesses. And this city of London at the moment houses probably the 500 of the biggest banks in the world have their offices there. The World Monetary Fund and all the bad guys are there. Now, because it's independent, it does not have to tell anybody, including the country, the king, or anybody. They pay no taxes, and they've always been exempt from that. When the king later, King somebody, Henry, I think, ordered a census of the whole country so he knew what land was there, who owned what, and what sort of taxes he could collect, and what sort of army he could put together. He surveyed the whole country and got a book written, and that's called the Doomsday Book, which lists all that sort of thing. London was exempt once again. No taxes and no need to defend the country. It was once again entirely independent. And since then, it always has been entirely independent. And as a result, they are not subject to the laws of England or any country in the world. They do whatever they like. They do exactly as they feel like. That means banks from all over the world, drugs barons, drug runners, gun runners, all the crooks of the world can now have a stake or a setup or a bank account in these banks that the country or the city-state of London, the City of London, does not have to declare to anybody. So lots of money can be hidden, invented, disappeared, done whatever way they want. They can invent money as they want, they can disappear money as they want, they can hide accounts as they want, they can launder money as they want, and the great big fat checks that your country received from the World Monetary Fund, the World Bank, over the COVID time were fictitious numbers that these banks write and send to the country, making it look like they're giving you something real, but it's entirely fake, and now you're enslaved to them over something that they just invented out of the thin air. Now the way the corporation was set up, by first being invaded, then it was convenient to have banks and things in commerce, then the king gave them their own set of rules, and then they eventually got independent and turned into, or recognised as, that bunch of people were now recognised as a corporate body, a corporation. So that thought process was very much around at the time of the establishing of the United States. So when the banks came into the United States and said to the government of the United States, we want you to make a corporate state, which was the county of Columbia, with a U, not an O, 10 square miles or something like that, they did basically the same thing, gave the city a charter. Now a charter is not law, it's a rule book that is below that of the law of the country. But just like London, when you start to rule, they start to use their rule book, their corporate rule book, over and above the law of the country. And that's basically what happened in the United States, as it had happened in England as well. So that London, the city of London, rules London, even though it does not belong to England. In fact, the Queen of England is subject to the city of London. And the United States as a corporation did exactly the same. Now the way that happened is very similar, and it explains how the United States got done. New Zealand got done because we wanted to do business. We left, they formed the European Economic Community, and we did not join it, so we had to restructure. And so we, through the 80s, privatised all of our assets that the country had. Anything that wasn't nailed down, they privatised and turned it into a corporation, a business, and sold it to the multinationals or put it on the stock exchange. So the whole country of New Zealand, and every government department, including the tax department, the social welfare, the education, medicine, everything that the country has is now corporations. Now that's a little bit of history as to the City of London. The City of London is what launders and controls all of the finances, basically. International trade, New York takes precedence, has probably a bit more of a volume, but the City of London trades at least 1.8, nearly $2 trillion a day that funnels in and out of their bank accounts. So it's big business. And they are allowed to continue to exist because the crooks around the planet are protected by that. Now all of the corporations of the world, the international corporations, are also protected by the corporation of the City of London, and those corporations then protect other corporations, and all the corporations are all protecting each other. And that's why we're in the mess we are today. It's like the Matrix. The multinational corporations, and the City of London is like the central CPU, or the hub of the matrix brain. That's where all the economics, the finances of the world funnel through, or channel through, like a nervous system that controls the rest of the world. And all of your politicians, governments, countries are all employees of these multinational corporations. It's a sticky situation we're in. However, it's not without hope. As I think I said in another video, it's easy enough for your country to declare a corporation dissolved. And all of its debts and assets and everything then gets divvied out, and debts get disappeared, and you can turn back into a country. But it would take a very valiant government to declare a multinational, their country corporation, dissolved, because the rest of the matrix will then attack. So it can be done if you're prepared.